Dr. Sarah Chen had attended enough formal Velyrian proceedings during her 3 years on their homeworld to know that the formal arbitration chamber was designed to intimidate. The crystalline architecture seemed to grow from the floor in patterns that suggested organic growth, but were clearly engineered for psychological effect. The bioluminescent panels cast everything in soft blue light that the Velyrians found soothing, but that made Sarah feel like she was drowning in deep water. Today, she was drowning in a different way, in legal arguments and precedents and systematic dismantling of everything she'd built with Lyra over the past 18 months. The arbitration concerned custody of the 6-year-old Velyrian child Sarah had been raising since Lyra's parents died in a transit accident. Sarah had been close friends with Lyra's mother. They'd bonded over shared interest in comparative cultural studies during Sarah's first year on Valyria. When the accident happened and Lyra was suddenly orphaned, Sarah had been named as emergency guardian in the household documentation. For 18 months, they'd been family. Sarah learning to prepare Valyrian foods that her human digestive system struggled with because they were Lyra's favorites. Lyra teaching Sarah the proper way to sing traditional bedtime songs, both of them grieving the loss of Lyra's parents while building something new together. It had worked, until Lyra's extended family decided they wanted her back. The family representative, Uncle Vethros, who Sarah had met exactly twice in 18 months, sat across the chamber with his legal advocates. His skin showed the confident gold of someone who knew Velyrian law was on his side. His argument was straightforward. Blood family has priority in custody matters. The emergency guardianship granted to Sarah was temporary arrangement, not permanent custody. Children belong with their family of origin, with those who share their genetic and cultural heritage, who can raise them according to proper Velyrian traditions. The fact that Sarah was human, an outsider despite her academic expertise in Velyrian culture, made her inherently unsuitable for permanent guardianship of a Velyrian child. The legal advocates were thorough. They presented case law spanning centuries. They cited precedents about cultural transmission, about children's rights to grow up among their own kind, about the primacy of blood relations in determining custody. It was systematic, comprehensive, and devastating to Sarah's position. Sarah's own attorney, a Velyrian named Kel'thara who specialized in interspecies law, did her best to counter. She emphasized the parents' documented wishes, Sarah's successful guardianship, Lyra's clear attachment and adjustment. She argued that trauma and attachment mattered more than genetic relationship, that Lyra's actual welfare should outweigh abstract principles about cultural heritage. But Sarah could see it wasn't enough. The 3 arbitrators, senior Velyrians tasked with making the custody determination, were showing skin colors that suggested they found the blood family argument more compelling. Traditional Velyrian law didn't prioritize individual attachment or preference. It prioritized family structure, cultural continuity, genetic relationship. By those metrics, Uncle Vethros's claim was stronger despite the fact that Sarah was the one who'd actually been raising Lyra for the past 18 months. Sarah tried not to look at Lyra, sitting in the designated area for affected minors. The child was being so brave, her skin carefully controlled in neutral colors, her ears in the formal position she'd been taught to maintain in legal settings. 6 years old and already learning to hide her feelings because showing emotion was considered inappropriate in formal proceedings. Sarah's heart was breaking, but she kept her face composed. Velyrians valued emotional control. Breaking down in tears would only reinforce the argument that humans were too emotional and unstable to properly raise Velyrian children. The lead arbitrator was preparing to deliver preliminary findings, the formal statement that usually preceded final ruling when something unexpected happened. Lyra stood up. She was small even for a Velyrian child, barely visible over the barrier of the minors' seating area. But she stood with determined stillness that made people notice despite her size. "I invoke Kel'thara vel Sythis," she said, her child's voice clear in the acoustically perfect chamber. Everything stopped. The arbitrators froze mid-gesture. The legal advocates stopped writing. Uncle Vethros's confident gold flickered to confused purple. Sarah, who'd spent 3 years studying Velyrian culture and law, didn't recognize the term. But she recognized the reaction. This was significant in ways she didn't understand. The lead arbitrator's skin had gone pale blue, shock or profound recognition. "Child," he said carefully, his formal tone softening slightly when addressing Lyra directly, "do you understand what you are invoking?" "Yes," Lyra replied with the simple certainty that only children possess when stating what they know to be absolutely true. "Kel'thara vel Sythis, the right of the innocent to speak truth, it is ancient law, older than the custody codes being applied today, older than the family priority statutes, older than most of the precedents that have been cited in this proceeding." She spoke with the kind of careful precision that suggested she'd memorized something important, something she'd been taught to say exactly right. It says that when a child speaks a rule without ambition or manipulation, when they state what is simply true without political calculation, that truth must be heard before all other arguments. It must be weighed as primary authority because innocence cannot lie for advantage. The chamber was absolutely silent. Sarah's attorney was staring at Lyra with an expression that suggested she was witnessing something she'd studied in legal history but never expected to see in actual practice. "The rule I speak," Lyra continued, her voice steady despite the weight of every adult eye in the chamber focused on her, "is written in the founding covenants. Before there were custody laws, before there were family priority statutes, before there were all the complicated rules about who children belong to, there was one rule about children." She paused, took a breath, and recited words that had clearly been carefully taught. "A child belongs where a child is loved. A child belongs where a child is safe. A child belongs where a child grows toward wholeness rather than toward what others believe they should be." Lyra's small voice carried across the chamber with absolute clarity. "That is Kel'thara vel Sythis. That is the rule that came before all other rules about children. And I state it now because these proceedings have forgotten it." The lead arbitrator looked like someone had just reminded him of a fundamental truth he'd spent years overlooking. His skin cycled through colors: shock white, assessment blue, reluctant acknowledgement purple. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone recognizing they were bound by law they'd forgotten existed. "The child has correctly invoked Kel'thara vel Sythis. The founding covenant she cites is." He paused, gesturing to bring up holographic displays of ancient texts. "Accurate, word for word from the original covenant recorded in the 1st century of our recorded legal history." He consulted with the other arbitrators briefly, their skin colors suggesting intense discussion compressed into formal gestures and color changes that Sarah's limited fluency couldn't fully interpret. "Under Kel'thara vel Sythis," the lead arbitrator continued, "when a child states ancient law, we are required to apply that law as primary authority superseding later statutes. This doctrine is rarely invoked because most children do not know the ancient covenants, but when invoked correctly, it is binding." Uncle Vethros's lead advocate stood, his skin flashing irritated orange. "Surely we cannot allow a child's statement, however well memorized, to overturn centuries of established family law precedent. She is 6 years old. She cannot possibly understand the complexity of—" "She is 6 years old and has stated the law correctly," the arbitrator interrupted, his tone carrying finality. "Age is irrelevant under Kel'thara vel Sythis. Indeed, the doctrine specifically values the voices of children, precisely, because they lack the ambition and political calculation that might distort truth in adult testimony." He turned his full attention to Lyra. "Child, you have invoked the founding covenant about children belonging where they are loved, safe, and able to grow toward wholeness. Do you wish to provide testimony about where you believe that place is for you?" "Yes," Lyra said. She was still standing very straight, maintaining the composure expected in formal proceedings, but Sarah could see the slight tremor in her small hands that revealed how much courage this was taking. "I loved my parents," Lyra began, her voice wavering slightly before steadying. "I miss them every day. When they died, I was so scared. Everything was wrong and I didn't understand why they were gone." Her skin shifted through colors: grief blue, fear white, gradually settling into something more complex. "Sarah took me in. She held me when I cried at night. She learned Velyrian lullabies even though human voices can't make all the right sounds. She makes my favorite foods even though they make her sick because human digestion is different. She asks me what I think and what I feel, and she listens to my answers like they matter. Lyra looked at Uncle Vethros directly. Uncle Vethros is family by blood, but I have met him twice in my whole life. He did not come when my parents died. He did not help me when I was scared and alone. He did not ask what I needed. He is here now because the law says blood family has priority. But that is not the oldest law. That is not the founding covenant. She turned to face Sarah, and for the first time since standing, her carefully controlled expression broke slightly, showing the love and trust that had been hidden behind formal composure. Sarah is not Velyrian. She does not always understand our customs. She makes mistakes with our traditions. She asks questions about things that every Velyrian child knows. But she loves me. I am safe with her. And with her, I am becoming whole again after my parents died. That is what the founding covenant says matters. That is where a child belongs. The chamber was absolutely silent for a long moment after Lyra finished. Sarah was fighting tears. Humans crying in formal Velyrian proceedings was culturally inappropriate, but she'd never been more moved or proud. The arbitrators were conferring among themselves, their skin colors suggesting they were navigating legal territory none of them had expected to encounter today. Finally, the lead arbitrator spoke. The child's testimony under Kel'thara vel Sythis is compelling and will be given primary weight in our determination. However, we must also consider whether the adult guardian, Dr. Chen, can adequately provide for the child's ongoing cultural and developmental needs as a Velyrian growing up in a non-Velyrian household. He looked directly at Sarah. Dr. Chen, you are human. You have studied our culture extensively, but you are not of it. You cannot fully embody Velyrian cultural transmission. How do you respond to the legitimate concerns about raising a Velyrian child when you cannot provide the cultural immersion that family of origin could offer? Sarah stood, her heart pounding. This was the moment that would determine everything. You're absolutely right that I'm not Velyrian, she said clearly. I make mistakes with your customs. I don't always understand the significance of traditional practices. I ask questions about things that seem obvious to those raised in your culture. But Lyra's parents knew all of that when they named me as guardian. They knew I was human. They chose me anyway. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. They chose me not despite being human, but because they wanted something specific for Lyra. They wanted her to grow up with someone who would love her unconditionally and prioritize her welfare above cultural conformity. They wanted her to have space to become herself, whatever that meant for her, rather than being pressured to fit into predetermined expectations. That sounds like criticism of Velyrian cultural values, Uncle Vethros interjected, his skin flashing defensive crimson. It's not criticism, Sarah replied. It's recognition that Lyra's parents had specific wishes for their daughter's upbringing. They valued your culture. They raised Lyra in it for 6 years. But they also wanted her to have freedom to choose her own path. That's why they chose a human guardian, to give her that option. The lead arbitrator studied Sarah with an expression that suggested he was weighing centuries of legal precedent against the ancient covenant a 6-year-old had just invoked. Dr. Chen, please be specific. If custody is granted to you, how will you ensure that Lyra maintains connection to Velyrian culture while also providing the freedom you suggest her parents desired? Sarah took a breath, organizing thoughts she'd had 18 months to develop, but never expected to defend in formal proceeding. I can't teach Lyra to be perfectly Velyrian. I can't transmit cultural knowledge the way someone raised in your traditions could. But I can do something else. I can teach her to value her heritage while not being limited by it. I can give her the Velyrian foundation her parents established while also letting her explore what it means to be herself. She gestured toward Lyra. For 18 months, I've been learning alongside her. We study Velyrian history together. We practice traditional arts, badly in my case, but we practice. We celebrate Velyrian holidays. We maintain connections with her parents' friends who knew them and can share stories and traditions I could never teach. But you also expose her to human culture, Uncle Vethros challenged, to alien influences that dilute her Velyrian identity. I expose her to options, Sarah corrected, to the idea that she can honor where she comes from while also exploring who she wants to become. Her parents wanted that for her. They told me explicitly, many times, that they chose a human guardian specifically because they wanted Lyra to grow up understanding that cultural heritage is important but not determinative, that she could respect tradition while also questioning it. The lead arbitrator's skin shifted to contemplative blue. And if her path leads away from Velyrian culture entirely, if she grows up identifying more as human than Velyrian because of your influence, then that will be her choice, Sarah said firmly, made from a foundation of love and safety. The founding covenant that Lyra cited doesn't say children must conform to cultural expectations or maintain traditional identity. It says they must be loved, safe, and able to grow toward wholeness. I can provide that environment. I am providing it. Whether her wholeness includes traditional Velyrian culture or something entirely different, that's for her to discover, not for me or Uncle Vethros or anyone else to dictate. You would let a 6-year-old determine her own cultural identity? One of the other arbitrators asked, his tone suggesting he found this concept troubling. I would let a 6-year-old grow into whoever she's meant to be, with guidance and support, but without forcing her into a predetermined mold, Sarah replied. That's what her parents wanted. That's what they chose me to provide. And that's what the founding covenant says matters, not genetic heritage or cultural conformity, but love, safety, and growth toward wholeness on the child's own terms. The arbitrators conferred again, their discussion lasting several minutes while Sarah stood trying to maintain composure. And Lyra waited in the minors' area with that heartbreaking combination of hope and fear visible in her skin colors. Finally, the lead arbitrator returned his attention to the chamber. This court finds that the child's invocation of Kel'thara vel Sythis is valid and binding. The founding covenant cited, a child belongs where they are loved, safe, and able to grow toward wholeness, predates and supersedes the current family law codes governing custody determination. His skin shifted to formal judgment blue. Under the authority of that ancient covenant, we are required to prioritize the child's actual welfare as defined by love, safety, and environment conducive to growth, rather than genetic relationship or cultural conformity per se. Uncle Vethros's skin flashed angry crimson. You cannot seriously be. We find, the arbitrator continued, speaking over the objection, that Dr. Sarah Chen has demonstrated adequate provision of love, safety, and environment supportive of growth toward wholeness. The child's own testimony under Kel'thara vel Sythis, which doctrine requires we treat as uncontaminated by political motive, confirms her well-being and secure attachment to her current guardian. He paused, letting the weight of what he was about to say settle over the chamber. Therefore, permanent custody of the minor child Lyra is granted to Dr. Sarah Chen, as per the original designation by the child's deceased parents and as supported by the requirements of the founding covenant invoked through Kel'thara vel Sythis. This is unprecedented. Uncle Vethros stood, his entire body language radiating outrage. You are allowing a human, an alien, to raise a Velyrian child based on ancient law that hasn't been actively applied in living memory. This will set precedent that undermines the entire foundation of family custody law. We are applying the law as it was correctly invoked, the lead arbitrator replied, his tone suggesting the matter was settled. Kel'thara vel Sythis exists precisely for situations where later statutory developments have obscured fundamental truths. The child spoke that truth. We are bound by our own legal traditions to honor it. He stood, signaling the proceeding was concluded. The ruling is entered into record. Custody is granted to Dr. Chen. This arbitration is concluded. After all the formalities, after Uncle Vethros and his advocates departed with angry skin colors and muttered promises to appeal, after the arbitrators left and the chamber began to empty, Sarah finally approached Lyra. The child was standing very still, processing what had just happened with the serious expression of someone much older than 6. How did you know that law? Sarah asked gently, kneeling so they were at eye level. The Kel'thara vel Sythis. I've studied Velyrian legal history for years and I'd never heard of it. My mother taught me, Lyra said quietly, when I was very small. She said it was ancient covenant that protected children. She said if I ever felt scared or threatened, if grown-ups were making decisions about me that felt wrong, I could speak it and people would have to listen. Her skin shifted to memory blue. She made me memorize it. The exact words from the founding covenant. I practiced saying it until I could recite it perfectly. I didn't understand why it was so important until today. Your mother was very wise, Sarah said, feeling tears threatening again. She was, Lyra agreed. Then, finally dropping the formal composure she'd maintained throughout the proceeding, she wrapped her small arms around Sarah and started crying. Not sad tears, but relief and release. I was so scared they would make me leave you, she sobbed. I was so scared I would have to go live with Uncle Vethros and I would never see you again. I was scared too, Sarah admitted, holding the child close and not caring any more about Velyrian cultural expectations regarding emotional control. But you were incredibly brave. You spoke truth that even the adults had forgotten. You reminded them what the law was supposed to protect. My mother said the oldest laws were the best ones, Lyra said, her voice muffled against Sarah's shoulder. Because they remembered what mattered before people made everything complicated. Your mother was right, Sarah replied. 3 days after the ruling, Sarah's colleague Dr. Marcus Webb visited their home with the kind of barely contained academic excitement that suggested he'd discovered something fascinating. I've been researching Kel'thara vel Sythis since the arbitration, he said, pulling up references on his tablet. It's absolutely remarkable. Ancient Velyrian legal doctrine that specifically values children's voices in formal proceedings because they're considered incapable of political manipulation. He scrolled through translated texts. The founding principle is that children under age 10 lack the cognitive development for sophisticated deception or ambition-driven testimony. Therefore, when they speak formal law or invoke ancient covenants, their words are treated as pure truth, uncontaminated by adult political calculation. Lyra certainly seemed to understand what she was doing, Sarah observed. Oh, she understood the words, Marcus agreed. But the doctrine assumes she couldn't have been motivated by political strategy or manipulation. She's too young for that complexity. So her invocation was treated as genuine expression of truth rather than tactical legal maneuver. That's why it carried such weight. He looked up from his tablet. The fascinating part is how rarely it's invoked. Most children don't know the ancient covenants. Most adults have forgotten them. But when a child does invoke Kel'thara vel Sythis correctly, it essentially hits a reset button on legal proceedings, forces arbitrators to apply foundational law that predates all the statutory complexity that's accumulated over millennia. Lyra's mother taught her deliberately, Sarah said, made her memorize the founding covenant about children belonging where they're loved and safe, like she knew something might happen and wanted Lyra to have that protection. Smart woman, Marcus observed. To recognize that ancient law could protect her daughter even after the parents were gone. To give her a weapon made of words that adults would have to respect because of the doctrine of innocent truth. He paused, his expression shifting to something more serious. You know this is causing ripples, right? The ruling is already being cited in other custody cases. People are digging up ancient covenants that have been buried under centuries of statutory law. You've accidentally triggered a legal reformation. Lyra triggered it, Sarah corrected. I just benefited from her courage to speak. Fair point. Marcus stood, preparing to leave. Still, think about what happened. A 6-year-old child stopped an entire formal arbitration just by stating a rule everyone had forgotten. Made officials stop writing. Made arbitrators apply law that predates their entire legal code. Forced the system to remember its own foundation. That's what children do sometimes, Sarah said, glancing toward the garden where Lyra was playing with the kind of unself-conscious joy that had been missing during the custody proceedings. They remind us of truths we've buried under layers of complexity. They speak what's obvious to them, but forgotten by adults who have learned to accept compromised versions of justice. Innocence as authority, Marcus mused. Truth that needs no power beyond its own clarity. It's philosophically elegant. After Marcus left, Sarah found Lyra in the garden. The child was arranging stones in patterns, singing quietly to herself in Velyrian, one of the traditional songs her mother had taught her. Lyra, Sarah said gently, can I ask you something? Yes, Sarah. When you stood up in the arbitration and invoked Kel'thara vel Sythis, were you scared? Lyra considered the question seriously. Yes, very scared. But my mother told me that sometimes being brave means doing what's right even when you're scared. She said the founding covenant was there to protect me, but only if I was brave enough to speak it. You were very brave, Sarah confirmed. I had to be, Lyra replied simply. Because the grown-ups were forgetting. They were talking about blood family and cultural heritage and legal precedent, but they weren't talking about love. They weren't talking about safety. They weren't talking about what actually matters for children. She looked up at Sarah with those large, expressive Velyrian eyes. My mother told me that sometimes the oldest rules are the truest ones because they were made before people learned to make things complicated. The founding covenant is simple. Children belong where they're loved and safe and can grow toward wholeness. That's true. The grown-ups needed to remember that's true. Sarah knelt beside her. You helped them remember. You spoke truth that even the arbitrators had forgotten. That's a powerful thing. It's just what's real, Lyra said, returning to her stone patterns. Grown-ups make everything complicated, but some things are simple. I love you. I'm safe with you. I'm growing into who I'm supposed to be. That's what the founding covenant says matters, so that's what I told them. And they listened, Sarah noted. They had to, Lyra replied with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood. That's what Kel'thara vel Sythis means. When children speak truth, grown-ups have to listen. My mother said that's because children can see things clearly before they learn to see things the way they're supposed to. Sarah watched Lyra return to her play, singing softly and arranging stones with the kind of focus that suggested she'd already moved past the arbitration and back into the immediate present where 6-year-olds naturally existed. A small alien girl had stated a rule, one so old it predated the laws being recorded in the arbitration. The human had blinked in silence, not understanding the significance until the entire proceeding stopped. The officials had stopped writing, forced to acknowledge authority they'd forgotten existed. And the system had been reminded of its own foundation, that children belong where they're loved, where they're safe, where they can grow toward wholeness rather than toward what others believe they should be. Innocence had spoken truth without political calculation. And that truth, uncontaminated by ambition, had proven more powerful than centuries of legal precedent. Because sometimes wisdom surfaces from the least expected voice, and sometimes the most profound authority belongs to those too young to wield power through anything other than clarity of vision and purity of intent. Lyra had reminded everyone what the law was supposed to protect, and in doing so, she'd protected herself, not through manipulation or strategy, but through the simple act of speaking what was true before she'd learned that truth could be complicated by adult considerations. The founding covenant remained. Children belong where they're loved, where they're safe, where they can grow toward wholeness. A 6-year-old had spoken it, and an entire legal system had been forced to remember why that covenant existed in the first place. Before the complexity, before the precedents, before adults had learned to make exceptions to fundamental truth, there was one simple rule. And sometimes it takes a child to remind everyone that simple truth matters more than sophisticated arguments. That's what Lyra had done. That's what Kel'thara vel Sythis existed to protect. And that's what would endure long after the arbitration was forgotten, the truth spoken by innocence, the authority of those too young to lie for advantage, the wisdom that surfaces when children remind adults what actually matters. Sarah watched Lyra play and thought about ancient covenants that protected children by valuing their voices above adult calculation. And she was grateful to Lyra's mother, who'd known to teach her daughter law that could protect her even after the parents were gone. Truth spoken by innocence, authority that needs no power beyond its own clarity. A small voice reminding everyone what they'd forgotten. That was enough. That was everything.